Thank you for having me. What I'm going to talk about today is a longitudinal survey of delinquency and crime, which I've worked on since 1969, although it was begun by my colleague Donald West in 1961. So this study has been continuing for some 30 years. Let me just show you a summary of the design of the study. The main aim of the study was to investigate the development of delinquency and crime, basically from childhood through the teenage years into adulthood. There was a concern with why offending began, why it continued, and why it ended in the usually in the 20s. It's a survey of 411 London males. They were all boys aged 8 to 9 in 1961 to 62 who were attending 6 adjacent primary schools, state primary schools, in a small area of south-east London. The area is called Camberwell. It's quite a poor working class area, very traditional British working class area, and at that time the vast majority of these males were white, reflecting the fact that the area was very homogeneously a white working class area at the time. So 97% of these males were white, only 3% were black, of African or Caribbean origin. As I say, they are really a complete sample of boys of that age in that neighbourhood at that time. What we did was to establish a research office in Camberwell and then to enlist 6 schools within a 1-mile radius of the research office into the study. What we then did was to interview these males at 8 ages, as you'll see. Beginning at age 8 in their schools, we interviewed them and had them complete a number of tests. We repeated that at age 10, age 14, and then at age 16, when the majority had left school, because for this cohort, born mainly in 1953, the school leaving age was 15, minimum school leaving age was 15. So by age 16, about 80% had left school. They were interviewed at 16, then at 18. Then we interviewed subsamples of mainly focusing on the convicted ones at 21 and 25 before the last major interviewing attempt at age 32, which we completed in 1985 to 87, when we managed to interview 94% of those who were still alive. As you will see, we interviewed 95% of the whole sample at age 18 and 94% at age 32, so we were very successful in maintaining contact with these males over this quarter of a century period. Generally, the ones who died first tended to be the most delinquent boys, unfortunately. The first 6 who died were all convicted males in this study, and indeed this agrees with other surveys in showing that convicted males live rather exciting, reckless, risk-taking lives and therefore have a rather higher mortality than unconvicted males. For example, the first male in our study who died was a boy at age 17 who had already accumulated 20 convictions up to that point. He was sent to a penal institution and he died while trying to escape from the penal institution. He tried to swim across a fast-flowing river and was drowned. So one can see why delinquents have a higher mortality. It's maybe one reason why crime decreases with age in cross-sectional studies. Anyway, we were able to maintain contact with the vast majority by persistence. It took quite a long time to track down some of our males. For example, at age 32, the most elusive male was one of our black males who eventually we found out had moved to New York, and he only had a mother. He had no other relatives, and that's one of the reasons we found it difficult to contact him. But we eventually contacted him at age 32. So in trying to track them down, we first of all used the easy methods like the electoral register and the telephone directory, and then gradually we moved on to more difficult methods such as going round to previous addresses, going round to parents, going to siblings, using leads from other males. For example, whenever we had an interview with the males, we would say, here's a list of all the other boys who were in your primary school class. Do you know where any of them are now? And in fact, half of the males knew where some people were at age 32, and those leads were quite useful. and also other leads we had from the fact that they were recently convicted was useful as well. But anyway, eventually we found them all at age 32. Only 6% refused to be interviewed. So we have a relatively complete sample over the years. You'll see also we interviewed their parents, usually the mother actually. The mother was the main one that was interviewed every year from when the boy was 8 until when he was 15 and was in his last year of compulsory schooling. We also saw the majority of the fathers, but information from the fathers was less complete than of the mothers. We also had the boys' teachers rate them when they were aged 8, 10, 12 and 14. Teachers' ratings of such things as school achievement and truancy and school behaviour. We've also collected extensive criminal records on this sample, not only of the males themselves, but also of all their biological fathers, biological mothers, full biological brothers and sisters, all their wives and cohabitees, and all their co-offenders. Anybody who was ever convicted with one of our males, we searched the complete criminal record of that person. So we have all the criminal records of all co-offenders of our males. I'm happy to say that I recently was successful in getting a grant from the British Home Office to bring these criminal record searches up to the present day. The last searches we did finished in 1987, but I just had a new grant beginning in September this year to bring all these criminal record searches up to date, up to the present. So currently we are searching in the Criminal Record Office in London and also in the Offenders Index, which is another criminal record service in England. And we're bringing all these records up to date. And also for the first time we're searching the children of our males. So we'll now have a 3-generation study. And when all these searches are finished next August, which actually is when the youngest boy will reach his 40th birthday next August, the youngest male I should say, I can't call them boys if they're 40, you know, but, when the youngest male reaches the age of 40, we will then have the criminal records up to that time. And, as I say, tremendous amount of detail about offending in families, in related people. So to summarise the study, we have multiple data sources, as you will see, from the males themselves, from their parents, peers, teachers, and from records. And we have actually other records as well. For example, we searched all the records of registered drug addicts, and we had other medical record searches as well in this study. So we've basically collected a lot of data on these males. Multiple constructs, we've measured. There was an effort made really to try and measure everything that was alleged to be correlated or predictive of offending. So we have lots of individual factors such as intelligence, impulsiveness. We have parental factors, parental supervision, separations from parents, for example. We have peer factors, certainly peer delinquency, popularity measures with peers. We have school measures such as the delinquency rates of the schools the boys were attending. And we have later measures. You missed the key thing, Ken. And we have later measures of the employment of histories of the males and their marital histories. So we've collected a lot of data over time about these 411 males and about all their relatives. Let me just summarise some of the results briefly about criminal careers. I did talk about criminal career research in more detail this morning, so I apologise to any of you who were present this morning, but this is summarising some of the key conclusions. See, 37% of our males convicted up to age 32, 153 boys convicted of criminal offences. That is defining these offences as offences normally recorded in the Criminal Record Office, which includes mainly theft, burglary, robbery, violence, vandalism, fraud and drug use offences. It excludes virtually all motoring offences and simple drunkenness and various other types of offences. So it's relatively serious offences, 37% convicted of relatively serious offences up to age 32. The peak age of conviction, 17. We also had self-reports from the males at different ages, actually at all ages from age 14. At age 14 we asked about offences that they had committed which had not necessarily come to the notice of the police, and we repeated those kinds of questions at every age, 14, 16, 18, etc., up to age 32. So we have extensive self-reported delinquency, self-reported offending information about the males, and this just notes that the self-reports generally show a peak age for most types of offences between ages 15 and 18. Not all types, for example, violence and drug use and fraud were a bit later, but most of the common types of offences like burglary, taking vehicles and theft peaked at 15 to 18, according to self-reports as well as according to convictions. The average age of onset of offending was 17. That's because of some late onsets. The peak age of onset was actually at 14, but the average age of onset was 17. Average age of desistance, that is the age of the last conviction, 23. So you have an average 6-year criminal career, at least official criminal career. Average 4.5 crimes leading to conviction in the average 6-year career. So roughly 4.5 convictions in the average 6-year criminal career. Considerable continuity in offending. 73% of those convicted as juveniles, that is under age 17, between ages 10 and 16, were reconvicted at ages 17 to 24. 45% of juvenile offenders were reconvicted at 25 to 32. And it wasn't really a continuity in official reaction to offending, because we saw very similar continuity figures when we looked at self-reports over time, and also when we looked at self-reports of unconvicted people. Even if we restricted the study to unconvicted people, there was marked continuity in self-reports over time, which to some extent matched the continuity in official records. We had a group who we call chronic offenders. 6% of the sample committed half of all the crimes, at least half of all the recorded crimes, up to age 32. And actually these males at different ages committed a substantial proportion of all self-reported crimes. For example, between ages 15 and 18, they committed about half of all burglaries and half of all vehicle thefts, according to their own self-reports, these same 24 males in the sample. When we looked at the concentration of offending in families, it was even greater than this, because 4% of the families accounted for half of all the convictions of all family members. That is, when we added together biological fathers, biological mothers, all sons and all daughters, only 4% of families account for half of all convictions, and really you do see tremendous concentration of offending in some families. Also, early onset predicts many crimes and a long criminal career. The ones who start earliest at ages 10 to 13 tend to have the longest and most persistent criminal career. And we also investigated co-offending. Since I didn't talk about that this morning, perhaps I should just summarize some of our results there. Basically, about half of all offences were committed with others, usually with one or two others. Large groups were not so common. The average size of offending groups declined linearly with age, from age 10 to age 32. In fact, there was a correlation of about minus 0.8 between the average size of the offending group and age between 10 and 32. So, as I say, co-offending declined linearly with age. Before age 17, the average offence was committed with others. After age 17, the average offence was committed alone. The others at early ages, under age 17, tended to be other males of very similar ages living close by, and the offences tended to be committed relatively close to where the males lived. Whereas as the males got older, the age difference of all the offenders in an offending group was greater. By the time people were 25, they may be committing an offence with an 18-year-old and with a 30-year-old, which you certainly didn't get at younger ages. And also they were travelling farther to commit their offences. They were becoming more discriminating in selecting their targets. Very few of these males committed offences with females, and in fact the majority of female co-offenders were relatives. They were either sisters or wives or cohabitees typically. Brothers, co-offending with brothers was quite common, especially if the boy had brothers within 2 years of age of him. So you tended to co-offend with brothers if you had brothers close in age. So as I say, we did quite a lot of work on co-offending in studying the development of criminal careers. Right, let me move on to some key predictors of offending by our males. Generally, the key predictors measured at age 8 to 10, which really boil down to 6 groups, and these were all independently predictive of later offending of the males. First of all, a group you might call socioeconomic deprivation, coming from a low-income family at age 8, living in poor housing, and that's also actually related to having a large-sized family at age 8. Should say very few of these families at that time were one-parent families. Almost all had 2 parents. This is, remember, in the early 1960s that we started off this study. Another group, poor parenting. This is ratings by our interviewers who in the first few years were psychiatric social workers, ratings of harsh or erratic discipline, ratings of poor supervision where the parent didn't know where the boy was when he was out, and separation from parents for reasons other than death or hospitalization. So if the boy had been separated from one of his parents, usually the father, because of divorce or disharmony, then that predicted the fact that he would later become an offender. By the way, these factors predict self-reported as well as official offending, and it doesn't make a dramatic amount of difference which indicator you use. Having convicted parents or siblings, an important independent predictor. As I said, crime tends to be concentrated in certain families. Low measured intelligence, low school attainment, highly related to each other and certainly an independent predictor of offending. Being hyperactive, impulsive, lacking concentration in school. Again, an important independent predictor. It's the most impulsive boys who later became offenders. And also child antisocial behaviour, which the best predictor was a teacher and peer rating of troublesomeness at ages 8 and 10. So if the boy is said to be troublesome or dishonest, then that predicted the development of later offending. So these seem to be the most important independent predictors in the study. While we had a lot of different measures, these came out as the most important. I'll be very happy, by the way, to take questions. I'm not planning to talk for a vast amount of time. Yeah, go on.
How intercorrelated were those items that you used, and how much variance did you explain involved?
Well, on conventional variance measures, the multiple correlation would generally be about 0.5, so it would be about 25% of variance. But I don't know that's a very useful way of looking at it because, in a way, you get better measures of, better indications of predictability by looking at things like the odds ratio, where you may see a trebling of risk. I mean, for example, if you take the correlation between intelligence and delinquency, that correlation may be about, say, minus 0.35, which looks as though you can't predict very well. But if you identify those with an intelligence of less than 90, and you use that as a predictor of delinquency, you find that multiplies the risk. Certainly the odds ratio is about 3. So it's kind of a risk increase of roughly 3 to 1, which gives you a slightly different view of the impact of the variable. I mean, if you look at if you say it can only explain 10% of the variance, then you may think it's not a very good predictor. Whereas if you say, well, low intelligence boys are 3 times as likely as other boys to become delinquent, you realize the prediction is a bit better. And one problem with these variables, with many variables, is that you tend to get non-linear relationships such that low intelligence is related with a high probability of delinquency, whereas other levels of intelligence are not particularly discriminating. And the same is true with many variables. It's particularly true actually with the age of the mother at the boy's birth, because if the the age of the mother at the time of the first child she has, if the mother's a teenage mother at the time of the first child, that's highly predictive of the boy being convicted. But other ages of the mother doesn't matter that much. It's again, so often you get non-linear relationships. I think it's better very often to look at the most important, the risk category, if you like, and see how that's related to increases in risk. So I think many people who use variance perhaps come up with misleading conclusions that you can't predict anything. Because, you see, if you look at a 2x2 table, I mean, a correlation of 0.3 in a 2x2 table corresponds very much to something like a 30% difference in percentages between the categories. So, for example, if you did a study of low intelligence versus delinquency, you might find 50% of the low intelligence category were delinquent versus 20% of the other category. And that corresponds to a correlation of 0.3, 9% of the variance explained, which looks as though you can't predict, but 50% versus 20%, you know, it is actually an odds ratio approaching 3, so you can predict. So I think a lot of your conclusions depend to some extent on what statistics you use. But I think, anyway, I focus more on odds ratios for one reason or another, because I think they give a more meaningful and really more accurate idea about predictability. Anyway, I think the first thing you said was how intercorrelated are these variables. The answer is generally they are all intercorrelated. But in the analyses, as far as possible, we tried not to include variables that were highly intercorrelated because we wanted to avoid problems of multicollinearity. So we tried to get variables that were, while intercorrelated to some extent, not intercorrelated to a high enough extent to mess up the analysis. Right. Some key correlates at 18 of offending. Remembering that offending generally involves theft, burglary, and taking vehicles. What we found was that the offenders, particularly the convicted offenders at age 18, tended to be deviant in a variety of different respects. For example, they tended significantly to be drug users, which at age 18 was mainly marijuana, but was highly related to offending. Tended to be heavy smokers, heavy gamblers. They tended to have driven while drunk, which really meant driven after consuming 10 units or more of alcohol, where 1 unit corresponded, we have standard measures in England, 1 unit corresponds to a half pint of beer, a glass of wine, a single spirits, or something similar. Our delinquents at age 18 tended to be sexually promiscuous. They claimed to have had intercourse with several girls. In addition, they tended not to use contraceptives, and while these data raised problems of validity, later on we found that there was predictive validity because the males who claimed to have intercourse and not use contraceptives later on reported that they got married because they got their girlfriend pregnant. So we did find some predictive validity, which is an advantage of a longitudinal study. Let's say sex is particularly a problem in inquiring of the males, particularly at age 18, because they're so reluctant to say they haven't had intercourse because it's kind of too much of a stigma to say that. But you can, so we were rather doubtful about the validity of that measure. But as I say, if you follow up over time, you can find some predictive validity. Our convicted males tended to be members of antisocial groups. That is, they went around with a group of 4 or more other males, hanging around, getting into trouble of one form or another. They had anti-establishment attitudes. That is, negative attitudes to the police, to bosses, teachers, people like that. They tended to spend a lot of time hanging about the streets. They had aggressive attitudes, and they were aggressive in behaviour, although not so many were convicted of violence. They tend to have an unstable job record at 18, typically not staying very long in jobs, moving from one job to another. Although actually at age 18 they had relatively high income. It's interesting that at 18 our offenders generally had higher income than our non-offenders. If we compare convicted with unconvicted males, the convicted males are earning more, basically because at 18 they're immediately moving into well-paid dead-end jobs like builders, labourers, unskilled labourers. They get paid a lot, but of course the salary does not increase with time, whereas the unconvicted males were more likely to be bank clerks or students. They were in jobs with some future where they would get increased pay in the future. It's rather interesting, I think, that the peak age of offending, which in our study is about 17 to 18, coincides with the peak age of affluence for the offending males. Because, as I say, the offending males came from low-income families when they were aged 8, and by the time they're 32, once again, they're in low-income families. Low income at 8 very well predicts low income at age 32. But at age 18, it's the reverse. It's a complete reversal. The most delinquent males are the most affluent because they're in, as I say, well-paid dead-end jobs. So the idea of a simple relationship between lack of income and offending obviously is not true. Finally, tattoos. Everyone laughs when we talk about tattoos, but it's very marked as a predictor of offending. The majority of tattooed males, you can all hide your tattoos if you like, the majority of tattooed males were convicted. So this was a clear correlate of offending in this study. Maybe this is a feature of our society or of this particular time period. Maybe it's a function of where they got tattooed, which was often on fairgrounds or similar places, why they got tattooed, which was often a measure of daring, risk-taking, out with their mates. Could they show that they were courageous enough to be tattooed in a fairground? But anyway, the offenders were tattooed. Of course, the police know all about this. They always record tattoos on criminal records. It's very convenient for people to tattoo themselves. The police can recognise them. It's like having a car number on your back. You know, the police love it. So we know there's a correlation between tattoos and offending. The fact that offending is related to many other aspects of antisocial behaviour was true at age 32 as well. Although, of course, the age-appropriate manifestations change at different ages. For example, at age 32, our males who were still offending at that age tended to be living in rather poor accommodation. They were very much renting. Interestingly, the whole sample were upwardly mobile because while hardly any of them at age 8 had parents who owned their own houses, they were almost all renting in rented accommodation at age 8. By the time they were 32, about half were owner-occupiers. So they're moving up, but hardly any, very, very few of the convicted ones were owner-occupiers. They were almost all renting. And sometimes they had rather substandard accommodation. So poor accommodation is a correlate. Poor cohabitation history. By the age of 32, some of our males who were still being convicted had gone through 2 wives and several cohabitees, and generally you have multiple partners for the males. They don't stay with anybody for any particular length of time. You might say they have all the fun. Generally they're unsuccessful with children. They tend to... they're often separated from their children because they're divorced. If they have children, they often report that their children have problems. It's often rather tragic, I think, because our males who married at the earliest ages, under age 21, reported a certain number of children at that age, and then when we asked them about all their children at age 32, a fair number of them didn't mention any of the children that they reported at age 21. And I think what it was, they got married at an early age. I should say again, this was an age cohort who generally got married. It would not be true of persons born in later years, but this 1953 birth cohort generally got married. And but then they would get divorced and they would lose contact with their children. And indeed, they would deny all knowledge of their children by the time we were interviewing them at 32. So when for our latest criminal record searches, we've made careful lists of all the children in order to search the children's criminal records. And let's say we found quite a number who were reported at 21 and not reported at 32. The males at 32, again, the convicted males, those who were still offending, had an unsatisfactory employment history still relatively, but generally employment histories were much more stable at 32. Generally, most people were having relatively long time periods in the same job. So there's no doubt between 18 and 32, employment histories generally were far more stable. Same is true with the next one. Again, our convicted males were much more involved in street fights than the unconvicted males, but fights had gone down a lot. Violence declined considerably between 18 and 32. However, we move on to the next one, substance use. That was not true. Marijuana use went down between 18 and 32. About 31% reported marijuana use in the previous 3 years at 18, as opposed to 21% at 32. But the use of all other drugs went up considerably. And we had, I think, something like 10% who had used drugs like cocaine, heroin, or hallucinogens or other things. We asked about a whole series of drugs, and that was many more than at 18. So it seemed that drug use had increase between 18 and 32. Whether this was an aging effect or a period effect is probably questionable, because it could be that in the 1980s, remember these interviews were between 85 and 87, it could be that multiple drug use was more common than in the early 1970s when the previous 18-year interviews were given. We gave a thing called the General Health Questionnaire at age 32 to detect psychiatric illness, and persons who score more than 4 on this questionnaire apparently qualify as psychiatric cases, according to the validity studies. 1/4 of our males scored 4 or more and therefore appeared to resemble psychiatric cases, and the convicted ones significantly were more likely to have high General Health Questionnaire scores, therefore indicating psychiatric illness. I should say, as a digression, that after I complete the present round of criminal record searches, I'm planning to collaborate with a forensic psychiatrist called John Gunn in interviewing all these males in their early 40s and giving them not only the usual social interview that we've always given them, but also a special psychiatric interview, basically inquiring about their lifetime history of psychiatric illness and also making it possible to give current diagnoses. So the next step is to try and get funding for a more psychiatric assessment of the males in their early 40s. Then another correlate of offending at age 32 was heavy drinking. Again, this is something that increased between 18 and 32. There's no doubt that alcohol consumption was relatively greater at 32 than at 18. So it's interesting that some things are getting worse, like drug use and alcohol use. Some things are getting better. Certainly offending was declining generally, violence was declining generally, employment was getting much more stable. Again, you see the anti-establishment attitudes, and also poor relationship with parents was a correlate at 32. It's interesting that poor relationship with parents was not correlated to offending at 18. I think that's because it was much more common. It was relatively normal to be on bad terms with your parents at age 18, whereas by 32 it was more a symptom, more related to deviance, and vice versa actually with drunk driving, because given the amount of alcohol use at 32, drunk driving was relatively common. Something like half of all those who drove had driven after consuming more than 10 units of alcohol, which would certainly mean you'd fail the breathalyzer in England. And because it was common, drunk driving was not correlated with these other indicators of deviance or antisocial behaviour. So it's interesting that the correlations changed somewhat with age, partly reflecting how common the behaviour was. So what we concluded was that to some extent you have a kind of antisocial behaviour or antisocial personality syndrome that arose in the teenage years with various different age-appropriate manifestations, including delinquency and crime, and including also drinking and substance use and street fighting and such like, again with different age-appropriate manifestations at 32, when there are problems of violence to spouses, for example, problems of many breakings up with partners, and still some problems of employment histories, etc. But generally over time you get some persistence of antisocial personality and behaviour. It was certainly significant persistence, but also some changing. I mean, when we actually systematically measured antisocial personality according to these sorts of symptoms at different ages, we found that about 55% of those who were antisocial at 18 went on to be antisocial at 32, whereas only about 10% of those who were not antisocial at 18 went on to be antisocial at 32, and the backward percentages were somewhat similar. But generally, you have about half persisting, half not persisting, and that raises an interesting question as to why antisocial males at 18 do or do not go on to be relatively antisocial in their adult years up to age 32. Anyway, let me talk about some of the special analyses we did in this study. The advantage of a longitudinal study is that you can investigate lots of different things, and particularly you can investigate effects of life events on the time course of development. And the first of these analyses was a study of good boys from bad backgrounds, to simplify it. If one reports that boys from low-income families, boys with poor child rearing, boys with low intelligence, or boys with convicted parents tend to be convicted, people say, ho hum, we know anyway. You know, that fully agrees with our experience. And they're more interested in the question of why some boys from these backgrounds don't become convicted. And a way to say boys with these backgrounds become convicted, they say, well, that's just what we expected. And so we did a special study to investigate why boys from criminogenic backgrounds did or did not get convicted, and whether there were some protective factors. That's really what we were looking for. We were trying to see if there were any protective factors. And I think actually this is something which needs a great deal of research in the future, because so much of the past research on delinquency is focused on risk factors. We do know a lot about risk factors. We know very little about protective factors that might block risk factors, for example. Anyway, this analysis was used a very simple predictive measure that we developed when the boys were 16, and it was just basically 5 variables: low income, large family size, having convicted parents, poor parental child rearing behaviour, and relatively low intelligence. Basically 5 indicators which were predictive of conviction up to age 17. We identified a group of 63 boys who had 3 or more of these 5 risk factors. When they were followed up to age 32, we found that 46 of these males had been convicted, and we looked carefully at the other 17, and we found that a lot of them were described as withdrawn, shy boys. Actually, the most frequent significant variable there was having few or no friends at age 8. So the boys who came from criminogenic backgrounds but who were not convicted seemed to be rather shy and withdrawn boys. Actually, these unconvicted males at age 32 were relatively well behaved, in the sense that they didn't commit offences and they didn't take drugs, but they had a lot of other problems. For example, they were not unlikely to be homeowners. They were often living in dirty home conditions. They were the most likely of all groups to have never married, to have no wife or cohabitee, to be living alone. They were most likely to be in conflict with their parents, and they were most likely to stay in every night at 32, which may be why they're relatively well behaved. So you wouldn't necessarily say that they were well-adjusted males. Say they were rather shy, withdrawn, never got married, stayed in every night, had rather low-income jobs, low-status jobs at 32. So it seemed to us that being shy and having no friends was a protective factor, but it's not necessarily one that you would wish to foster in trying to prevent delinquency. And indeed, an alternative interpretation is that if you come from a very stressful background, that in a way the normal response is to be delinquent. The delinquents were better adjusted, really, and the abnormal response was to be shy and withdrawn, to have no friends. It seemed to be a kind of an abnormal response. But I think in a way it's the way we did the analysis. I mean, we rolled together not only things like low income and criminal parents and poor child rearing, but also low intelligence. And I think if we had instead said, let's look at well, in fact, we have done this. If you look at the boys from really deprived socioeconomic backgrounds, from, say, low-income backgrounds, and with poor child rearing, then you say, what's a protective factor? What comes out immediately is intelligence. If you come from a deprived socioeconomic background, then the way out is clearly through school success, and it comes out very clearly. So in a way, I think a better analysis might have been to focus on school success as a protective factor, because it certainly does appear to be a protective factor. Anyway, a few examples of studies of the effects of life events on development. First of all, what's the effect of going to a school with a high delinquency rate? When our males were 11, they transferred from the primary school to the secondary school in England, and they mostly went to 13. As I say, they were originally in 6 primary schools. They mostly went to 13 secondary schools. We obtained the delinquency rates of these secondary schools from the local education authority. That is, the percentage of pupils who were convicted. And we found that the boys who were in the most delinquent schools were most likely themselves to be convicted. So to some extent there's a correlation with that. We then said, well, is this a function of the schools? Is it that the schools themselves are making boys more delinquent or less delinquent? Or is it a function of selection? Is it that the worst behaved boys go to the high delinquency schools and the best behaved boys go to the low delinquency schools? So what we did was to look at our best predictor of delinquency, which was the rating of troublesomeness of the boy at ages 8 and 10 when he was in his primary school, and we found a very significant tendency for the most troublesome boys to go to the high delinquency rate secondary schools and vice versa. And indeed what we found was that the secondary schools themselves had little effect on delinquency. Once we controlled for the troublesomeness of the boys at their primary schools, going to a high delinquency rate secondary school or a low delinquency rate secondary school didn't make much difference. And what was happening here, I think, is that first of all the catchment areas of the secondary schools overlapped in London. They still do overlap in London. And so boys had a choice as to which secondary school they wanted to go to. The secondary schools also had a choice as to who they took. But the secondary schools varied considerably in their reputations. Some had a high reputation, others had a poor reputation. What tended to happen was that the high reputation schools were oversubscribed. A lot of boys wanted to go there, so the head teachers of the secondary schools could pick and choose, and they picked and chose the best boys. If they had a choice, they chose high-achieving boys who tended to be low delinquency boys. That's why they had low delinquency rates. Whereas the low-status schools basically acted as sink schools. They had to take the boys who the others rejected, or the boys whose parents really didn't care. Because, again, if you have parents who really care, the parents work hard to get you into the best schools. And generally the caring parents tend to have the high-achieving, well-behaved boys, and so it's all a kind of a interrelated system. But as far as our analyses showed, there didn't really seem to be much effect of going to a high delinquency as opposed to a low delinquency school on the boys' delinquency rates. Another analysis we did was to investigate the effects of convictions. This was within the idea of labelling theory. We thought that getting convicted might have a negative effect on the boys' delinquent behaviour. And so, also, of course, contrary theory might be focusing on deterrence or rehabilitation, in which case convictions might have beneficial effects on the boys' delinquent behaviour. But anyway, what we did was to track boys before and after they were convicted and look at their self-reported offending before and after conviction. And what we found was that generally boys' self-reported offending increased significantly after they got convicted. And we did various analyses to establish that it was the conviction that came before the increase in self-reported delinquency, rather than that it was the increase in self-reported delinquency that came before the conviction. So as far as we could tell, the main effect of getting convicted was that the delinquent behaviour of the males actually intensified. Why that was is not totally clear, but one of the things we found at age 18 was that increases in delinquency occurred particularly for boys who, on their first conviction, were given a discharge as opposed to a fine, because the most common penalties given in court after a first conviction was either a discharge, where they basically didn't do anything to you but just discharged you, or a fine where you had to pay a certain amount of money. And the increases in self-reported delinquency particularly followed the discharges as disposals. They were much less marked after fines. So we wondered whether it wasn't necessarily labelling or stigmatisation, but it could have been some sort of decreased deterrent effect, such that if you appeared in court and got convicted and then all you got was a discharge, you decided it wasn't that bad, and so maybe there was a kind of decreased deterrent effect of conviction. Another thing we looked at was the effect of getting married. As you know, some people think the best sentence for delinquent males is to sentence them to get married. Unfortunately, we don't have volunteer females for this sentence. But anyway, there's a widespread belief that getting married has a reformative effect on delinquent males. And indeed, we found this. We, again, tracked males in terms of their self-reported offending and in terms of their convictions before and after getting married. And we did the same in regard to convictions for their fathers. We did the same analysis tracking the conviction rates of fathers before and after they got married. And indeed, we found that marriage to an unconvicted woman was followed by a decrease in offending, both self-reported and official offending, by our males, and a decrease in official offending for their fathers. Unfortunately, marriage to a convicted woman was not. It was actually followed by an increase in offending. So the key issue is you need to marry a good woman to have any improvement. And again, there was a problem of what you might call assortative mating, in that, unfortunately, the majority of convicted women, at any rate, married convicted men. So the definite mating together of similar people. So the story in regard to marriage is not all good news. But anyway, generally, you did seem to find an effect of marriage compared with no marriage. Then we looked at the effect of moving out of London. Again, by age 18, the males were still generally with their parents, but after that they scattered and set up their own homes, and a fair number moved out of London, usually to the suburbs of Kent and Surrey and Sussex, which are rather desirable areas. And again, when we followed males who moved as opposed to those who didn't move, and we looked at self-reported and official offending before and after moving, again it seemed that if you moved out, you improved compared with similar males who didn't move out. And it seemed that it wasn't totally clear why this happened, but it did seem to be related to the breaking up of delinquent groups, because when the males moved out of London, they were no longer in delinquent groups, and that's why they seemed to improve. So maybe, again, moving out is a good treatment for delinquency. And the final analysis I'll mention is effects of unemployment. And I think this is interesting, again, as an example of what you can do with longitudinal data, because what we did was to look at, for example, at age 18, we had reports from the males of all their periods of employment and unemployment in the previous 3 years. And we then looked at their conviction rates during periods of unemployment versus their conviction rates during periods of employment. So we used each person as his own control, and we basically said for John Smith while employed, did he have a higher conviction rate than John Smith while unemployed? We couldn't do it for self-reports because we didn't have exact dates of offending with self-reports, but we could do it with convictions because we knew exactly when those offences were committed. And I think this kind of an analysis is much better than the usual analysis of unemployment and crime, which is either an aggregate study over time and place, or an individual correlational study where you show that unemployed people are more likely to be offenders, but then, unfortunately, unemployed people differ from employed people in a million ways, and it's difficult to control these extraneous variables. Whereas if you study John Smith while unemployed versus John Smith while employed, you're holding constant lots of individual difference type variables. The results were pretty clear-cut in showing that people committed more offences while unemployed than while employed. Furthermore, the effect was only true for offences which involve financial gain. The difference was confined to theft, burglary, fraud, robbery, and similar offences. There was no effect of unemployment on vandalism, drug use, or violence. So it seemed that what was happening here was that unemployment was causing lack of money, which was causing offences to get money. It wasn't that unemployment was causing boredom, which was causing some offending to relieve boredom, which might involve drug use or violence or vandalism. It seemed to be the key theoretical construct here was lack of money. But again, it's the kind of analysis you can do with longitudinal data, looking at within individual differences, so that you look at one person while unemployed versus the same person while employed. I'll stop in a minute, but let me just go on to say theory of offending. People always say, why don't you have a theory? So here's some theoretical ideas as to why we get these kind of results. Basically, the theory which I have put forward suggests a 4-stage process, beginning with energizing factors, which I've divided in this into long-term energizing factors such as desire for material goods, desire for excitement, desire for status with peers, desire to show masculinity, desire for sex, and other well-known desires. Again, in this theory, you may notice lots of concepts borrowed from other theories, so it could be called an integrative theory if one wished to do so. I've obviously pinched lots of ideas from other theories, but anyway, the idea, first of all, we have some energizing factors producing motivation. There's also short-term energizing factors, such as being bored, being frustrated, drinking alcohol, getting fired from a job, having a quarrel with girlfriend. I apologize because this is a highly male-orientated study and a highly male-orientated theory. But anyway, here we have energizing factors which produce some motivation, which could possibly lead to offending. But then you have directing factors, because, of course, you can achieve these aims by legitimate means, in theory. And so the key issue is really whether you can achieve some of these aims legally. And I've indicated people who have low intelligence and school failure are clearly limited in their ability to achieve these aims legally. The same is true for people from low-income families, actually, or deprived families. Maybe it's not so easy. If you're searching for excitement in the middle of London, you can't. The obvious way is to do something that gets you into trouble, really. You know, if that's your aim, if you're poor. Whereas maybe if you're searching for excitement and you live out in the suburbs, you can go and do something exciting, which is also at least vaguely legal. So we have energizing factors to start with, directing factors, which either direct you into legal or illegal activity. Then also we have inhibiting factors. This is very common in theories, such as an internal inhibition, such as conscience or guilt feelings, empathy or coldness, such that if you have empathy, you appreciate the feelings of the victim and you may have some sort of inhibition. And all the theories of internal inhibition, even Hershey's, which calls it self-control, Hershey and Gottfredson, but anyway, it's the same sort of an internal inhibition theory, suggests that this is built up through parenting, through modelling of parents, through warmth of parental interaction, consistency of parental-child rearing, etc. So again, even if you have some energizing factors, and because of your own, let's say, school failure, you try and achieve these aims illegally, well, you won't do it if you have inhibition. If you have a conscience, or if you have some internal inhibition, high self-control, strong bonding to society, call it what you want, then you won't do it. So internal inhibition's an important factor. And finally, you have a decision-making process, where in various circumstances you take account of opportunities, you weigh costs of offending against benefits of offending, you look at probabilities of getting caught, you weigh the immediate loot against the rather longer-term possibilities of getting caught by the police. Again, many theories have these decision-making elements, so even if your energizing motivation survives directing and inhibiting factors, whether you do it will depend on the situation. It's going to depend on situational factors. And here, something like impulsiveness is important. More impulsive people far more likely to be influenced by immediate gratification. They pay less attention to long-term goals. And here also you may have, some people may take more rational decisions than others. Again, if you ask people why they commit offences, they focus particularly on seeking excitement or on achieving material goods. Say this theory is actually based on our research to some extent. So we have asked people at different ages why you do different types of offences. And this seems to me to be one of the most plausible theories that might possibly explain our results, although, let's say, so far I've focused more on summarising the results rather than trying to be particularly theoretical. Anyhow, I think I will stop there. Probably presented enough to provoke some questions. Mm-hmm.
Over time, did you collect any measures that would indicate changes in the structure of the community that these people were living in, having to do, for example, with employment rates or other other factors that could measure the social structure of the community?
The answer is no. We didn't really. We have very few measures of that type. Initially, at the early ages, we did measure delinquency rates in neighbourhoods, so we were concerned where the boys lived, and we investigated whether the delinquency rate in the particular area that the boy lived predicted his own delinquency rate, and it did to some extent, but it was rather a weak factor. But apart from those early studies of delinquency rates in neighbourhoods, we have not tracked the neighbourhoods where the boys are living. Of course, you've got to remember they've scattered a lot over time. I mean, they stayed with their parents up to age 18 generally, but after then they would scatter all over the place. So you'd have to follow up quite a large number of communities if you were interested in the interaction between community factors and individual factors over time. But the answer is we didn't do that, I'm sorry to say.
You also mentioned the effect of conviction on subsequent behavior, but you didn't talk about type of sanction that they received, other than the brief look at the experiment of disposing of the case rather than processing at the juvenile level. What about length of time in incarceration or things of that sort?
We did look at that. We did look at incarceration, and we did ask them at different ages, what do you think the effect of imprisonment, what do you think is the effect of your sanction? Generally, what they said was that, I'm sorry to report, that they said that incarceration had an inhibiting effect, as a matter of fact. At least the most severe offenders who received it said that. Generally, they said probation had no effect. It was a joke going to see this fellow every month or so. They said discharge had no effect. They got let off. They claimed that fines had no effect. They claimed that imprisonment or incarceration had a big impact on them because they didn't want to go back. So they said. However, many did go back, when we actually followed them up. When we did systematic comparisons of incarceration sentences versus probation, which I know we did, I don't remember finding much differential effect on reoffending rate, on subsequent offending rate. So I think our analysis in regard to the effects of incarceration, there was some sort of inconsistency between what the males said, because they certainly claimed an inhibiting effect of being incarcerated. Certainly when they were interviewed, they said, I'm not going to do it again, I don't want to come back to this place again. But I think when we actually compared incarceration with probation and trying to compare it with similar types of people in terms of their self-reported offending before, I don't think there was much in the way of a differential effect. But I know we did those analyses, but I don't think much came out of them.
Didn't you do a comparison of those using self-report data as the constant, looking at those who were convicted and those who were not caught to get at some labeling effect, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's what I was talking about, yeah. We found that...
The control group that never had any contact.
Oh yeah, all these studies use control groups who were the same on self-reported offending beforehand, but who, then we investigated what happened to them afterwards,
Just one question.
Yeah.
Did you have any measures of deviant beliefs from individual definitions towards crime law
Mm-hmm.
and towards crime?
Well, it depends what you mean by deviant beliefs. We had a lot of attitudinal measures that we gave at different ages, and for example, the measure I mentioned of anti-establishment attitude might qualify as deviant beliefs, because we certainly had measures about how far they thought it was okay to commit crimes, and that was certainly related to offending. I haven't used those as possible causal factors because they're arguably measuring the same theoretical construct as offending itself. You don't want to put things into a prediction study that are measuring the same theoretical construct. So generally I have focused only on things that are clearly different, like low-income family is clearly different from offending, and having criminal parents is clearly different, but something like delinquent beliefs or even delinquent peers, it could be measuring the same variable, you see, because given that certainly under age 17 the majority of offences were committed with others, then in the majority of cases if you commit delinquency you must have delinquent peers. And so I haven't really done careful studies of the link between delinquent peers and delinquency because of the difficulty of disentangling them. We didn't really do that very well, I don't think.
And you mentioned that at age 32 there was a reduction in accomplices.
Right. All through, from 10 to 32, there was a steady reduction in co-offending, yeah.
So I'm
I don't know really. I mean, they're antisocial, certainly anti-establishment attitudes declined between 18 and 32. They were much more conventional at 32 in general. They were less anti-police, less anti-bosses. As I say, their employment records were more stable. They were generally more conventional people. They were getting worse on alcohol and drug use, but otherwise they were becoming more conventional with age generally. Yep.
Did your study have any policy recommendations? And if it did not, what policy recommendations for the government would be called from this study?
Oh yeah, our study did have policy recommendations, and we indeed put them forward to the government. Basically, let me go through them. First of all, because we found that low socioeconomic deprivation was an important independent predictive factor, we recommended that steps should be taken to give more economic benefits to poor families. So we said that, giving more money to poor families, or at least improving the economic circumstances of poor families, was desirable. Secondly, because poor child rearing was clearly a predictor, and again an independent predictor of offending, we recommended that investment should be made in parent training, particularly under age 10. And again, these things to some extent aren't out of the blue, because there's also relative, there is literature on that suggesting that parent training could be effective. So we did recommend the use of parent training. Thirdly, because we found that low intelligence was an important predictor, we recommended preschool intellectual enrichment programs, because we knew about the Perry program and other similar programs that did succeed in improving school success, and we also knew in the Perry program that the improvements in school success were associated with improvements in behaviour. So we recommended preschool intellectual enrichment programs to the government. And fourthly, because we knew that impulsiveness was an important factor, we recommended interpersonal cognitive social skills training programs, which actually usually target impulsiveness. What they're usually trying to do in behavioral social skills training programs is to try and increase the ability of the person to control the behavior. So really kind of self-control training programs. So we made all four recommendations to the government. The government, different governments have been quite receptive to this, but unfortunately, as the government changes, the receptiveness changes. I mean, we had one minister in the Home Office who issued a press release when our results from the latest follow-up was known in about 1989, saying, this is a wonderful study, it's a great example of how, research can inform policy, etc., and we ought to now go in. They particularly were interested in doing preschool intellectual enrichment programs and parent training. And they then drafted out a green paper before the last election. This particular minister in the Home Office, you see, in England, a green paper is a statement of government policy for discussion, and then it becomes a white paper, which is a statement of legislative intent. Then it becomes the Act, which is the law. And so they drafted a green paper all about early prevention of delinquency, focusing on our research. And I knew about it because they read out large chunks of it to me and said, "Do you agree with this?" And I said, "Yeah, I agree with it." It was all about parent training and preschool programs. They didn't like the bit about giving money to poor people. They wouldn't have that one. It's a question of whether it fits in with what they're going to do anyway. So they thought, again, it depends how you sell it. Because in England we have a conservative government. So if you say, family therapy, they'd never do that. But if you say parent training, it's kind of got the right authoritarian ring to it. That you can sell it to them. So parent training, preschool intellectual enrichment programs. They drafted out a green paper. But unfortunately, this was in about February '92, before the last election, and they thought it was too political for the election, and so actually a minister called Kenneth Clarke shot down the green paper. It was drafted by the Home Office, and they were all set to release it, but Clarke, who was then, I think, in education, basically shot it down. And then even more unfortunately, in April 1992, we had this general election, we had a new government came in, Clarke was made Home Secretary, and he was against it, because I know I had a friend of mine who's very high up in the Home Office who said to Clarke, "What about parent training and preschool education programs?" And Clarke said to him, quote, "Bugger off." I mean, Clarke basically said, "You're off your head, I'm not going to do it." Well, anyway, now we've got a new Home Secretary. They only last about a year, typically. So we've had another... Clarke's now gone to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. He's on his way up to Prime Minister, so he's doing well. But we have a new Home Secretary, whose main policy now is being tough on crime. So the first thing he did in his big statement at the Conservative Party conference in September, he says, we're going to lock up more people. That's, it's a new measure. We're going to be really tough on crime. I'm going to introduce a new Criminal Justice Act to lock up more people. So whether they're ever going to do this, I don't know. But the point is, I have a lot of contact with them. I mean, the Home Secretary before Clark, Kenneth Baker, invited me to lunch with him, and I had lunch with him. And I have I actually was invited to lunch also with. Who was the last one that invited me? Oh, it was in September. I was invited to lunch with Howard, the present one, but I declined. But we do have contact with the ministers, and we do have a chance to have our input with the ministers. But my experience of them is, if in a way you don't influence them that much because they have a political agenda. And if what you do kind of justifies their political agenda, they're pleased with it, and they'll quote it. But if what you do doesn't agree with it, they just ignore it. So I don't know that you're influencing them that much. I mean, I think they've got their own political agenda, and they will quote your research if it seems to back it up. But I think that's as far as I'd go. They seem to be vaguely interested. Certainly Baker was interested, and I was pleased that they drafted out this green paper, but then they shot it down, and there's no sign of it being resuscitated. So we do have, I guess we do have some input. Certainly to the career civil servants we have some input, but the problem is the minister keeps changing. Every year we have a new Home Secretary. So, the only thing about any Home Secretary is they're not going to be there that long. So, you have a new Dumbo in next year. So.
Would you say that the study replicated in the United States would probably have similar results? That policy recommendations would basically be the same?
Oh, yeah, I would say so, because I think similar studies have come up with similar results. I mean, like the work of Joe McCord and Lee Robbins and more recent work. I mean, even in Pittsburgh now, where we're following up Pittsburgh boys, I think we're finding the same factors like impulsiveness, like parental supervision, poor child rearing certainly come out as important variables. The trouble is, things change. I mean, like in Pittsburgh, you see, because it's a random sample of Pittsburgh public school boys, only 40% of the boys have got fathers with them. So it's very much one-parent family. So it's a rather different sort of population. But I think generally there's considerable replicability of the important risk factors for offending, certainly between England and the US. And also I think in other countries, certainly in Holland, the Scandinavian countries, Germany and Australia and New Zealand, I think you get the same results too. Certainly in showing things like poor parenting, low income always comes out, low intelligence and school attainment always comes out, criminal parents always comes out, and impulsiveness. I think all these factors are very replicable. The thing we find, actually one thing we studied in Pittsburgh in much more detail was neighbourhood factors, which we didn't study so well in England. And again, living in a poor neighbourhood comes in. But what seems to be the case in Pittsburgh is that there's a kind of a sequential relationship in that a poor neighbourhood seems to produce poor parenting, which then produces a boy with poor internal inhibitions, which then produces delinquency. It seems from our Pittsburgh data as though it's a kind of sequential effect. Neighbourhood affects parents, parents affect boy becomes delinquent. But I think generally the results are pretty replicable. Some of the key risk factors are replicable anyway.
Finally, would the study be the same if you concentrate on gangs?
Gangs? Well, I mean, we did ask about gangs. The problem was there are very few gangs in London at this time. Certainly these boys didn't belong to gangs very often. We had 20 boys at age 18 who claimed, according to our criteria, they were members of a gang, with a particular uniform, initiation ceremony, turf and name and such like, a structured gang. But they weren't that bad. I mean, they weren't particularly violent or delinquent. So we did look at gangs to some extent. But I don't think we had them. I think the problem is gangs are kind of, they're not necessarily present in every city. Certainly at the time that our boys were 18, they weren't particularly a problem in London. And I think, they're not there in many cities. I mean, I've done a lot of research, for example, in Nottingham, and I said to the Nottingham police, do you have gang problems here? And they said, no, nothing like that. So now maybe they have a misperception, but I don't think gangs has been much of an issue in England. Whereas, of course, it's been more of an issue in the US, particularly in the last 10 years, hasn't it? I know. But, I mean, as to whether the results will be different if we focused on gangs, I mean, I think you should focus on gangs, because it's an important topic. It's just that, they weren't really present in our study. The gangs were not there. according to any reasonable definition of gang. Obviously, co-offending's there, but once you start having, you have to have a uniform, you have to have a name, you have to have, roles in the gang, you have to have turf, such like. I mean, they're not there, really. They weren't there in our study, anyway. Yeah.
Of the 111 males that you looked at, were any of those in co-offending groups, and if so, were those co-offending groups different from other co-offending groups?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I guess first my question is were any of the 411 boys co-offending with each other?
Yes.
Okay. And was those co-offending groups that they were together with different than if they were with someone else that weren't in the group?
I don't know how to measure that, really. I'm not sure what you mean, different.
Either rate of crime or the type of crime?
Not really. Not that I was aware of particularly. I think one of the most interesting results in co-offending was our study of recruiters, because in our study we identified 22 boys who had 10 or more offences. They were the most frequent offenders. We looked at all their co-offenders, and we investigated whether their co-offenders were less experienced than they were at the time of the offence. In other words, what was the serial number for them of this? Say, two boys commit an offence together. One is our boy, one is the co-offender. What's the serial number of the offence of our boy in his criminal career? What's the serial number of offence in the other boy in his criminal career? And if the serial number is 1 for the other boy, and the serial number of our boy is 8, then arguably our boy is an experienced offender who's dragging a naive offender into the net of offending. And we found some boys, there was one boy in particular, who had 19 co-offenders, of whom 10 were first offenders and 18 were less experienced than him. So arguably he's a recruiter, right? And we had actually out of 22, I think we had 6 who were like that, who were accounted for almost all of the first offenders who were co-offenders, and always lots of less experienced co-offenders. And this was an interesting discovery, really, the recruiters, because if you do have boys who are constantly recruiting naive or inexperienced other boys into the net of offending, then these recruiters are obvious targets for some sort of action, because you would have a disproportionate impact on the crime problem if you targeted recruiters than if you targeted the average boy. And so I think looking at co-offending and identifying recruiters is an important issue. So I think that's another, as I say, lots of interesting things came out of our co-offending work, but I think that's one of them. Yeah?
I might be remembering this wrong, but I'm reading about the recruiters too, and it comes up when you said this one guy initiated 19 of the people.
Mm-hmm.
They did not have consistently relationships with that 19 as they moved.
Exactly, that's right. We also looked at how long the co-offending groups lasted, and we found only out of hundreds of co-offending groups, very few lasted more than a year. And the ones who lasted more than a year tended to be brothers. So if you have two brothers co-offending, they will persist. But mostly, co-offending groups do not persist. People keep on co-offending with different people. It's rare. The majority of your co-offenders are constantly different people. And your co-offending, even when you co-offend with the same person, the groups do not persist very long. So maybe this is a function of the generally poor relationships of many offenders, because we find that the offenders are generally unpopular at age 8 to 10, and so maybe they're the kind of people who don't keep relationships very long. I mean, they have poor relationships with their parents, and they have many wives and cohabitees, and maybe they're not the kind of people who have consistent relationships, so maybe it's not surprising that they don't persist with their co-offenders very long, but that was certainly a result. Actually, another interesting question, which so many interesting questions that come up, but another interesting question is whether sending a person to an institution creates new co-offending groups who are even worse than the ones before, because when you go to the institution, you meet some new offenders, and it would be interesting to know whether after you go to the institution, then you select the people you met in the institution as your new co-offenders, and then you get even worse co-offending groups. But we weren't able to investigate that very well because we didn't know who they met in the institution. But it's an interesting question for research as to whether going to an institution can create new co-offending groups. Yeah.
You mentioned this a little bit yesterday when we were talking about that, and then you mentioned it one time in the talk, and I wish you could talk some more about that Because I think that's an interesting idea that you don't hear a lot talked about, so it makes sense when you say it.
Well, yeah, I mean, you see, once you, let's say the problem is so much delinquency research is focused on the teenage years. You know, people never think about how things change over time. But it's clearly true that kind of the same underlying construct could have different behavioural manifestations at different ages. I mean, for example, if you're an unreliable person, maybe you're a truant at school and a kind of a poor employee later on in life, maybe. You know, it's interesting to investigate what are the equivalent manifestations at different ages. It's a basic problem of what to measure, really, if you're interested in continuity, because if you measure the same thing at different ages, it could be completely inappropriate. I mean, you don't want to measure truancy at age 30. You know, it doesn't exist. You don't measure marriage at age 10. It doesn't exist. So you can't always measure the same things, but you can try and measure some equivalent things if you think about them. It's something where there's been very little work on them, actually. And also the meaning of things change. I mean, as an obvious one, I mean, sexual intercourse at 13 has a very different meaning from sexual intercourse at 23, you know, where it may be more normative. And similarly, in our study, you have, you know, poor relationship with parents is much more normative at 18 than 32. It really means, it means a different thing, and it's differently correlated with other indicators of deviant and antisocial behaviour. I think, you know, once you do longitudinal research, you're faced with these issues all the time, but if you do cross-sectional research in the teenage years, you don't have to face these issues. But it's an important question, I think. Yeah.
Did you record how the males felt about their own delinquent and criminal behavior?
Oh, yeah.
Were they regretful?
Were they regretful? Not really, no, they weren't regretful. Usually they didn't really, the ones who committed offences didn't really show much guilt about it. They usually had what you might call techniques of neutralisation. You know, they usually said, oh, well, the victim never really suffered, they're all insured, or, you know, this kind of thing. I don't think they were regretful particularly. Sometimes, well, we always at many different ages we asked them why they committed offences, and sometimes they would commit offences deliberately as a kind of reprisal. You know, oh, we went and smashed up that person's car because we didn't like him. You know, he annoyed us one day or something. So the offending generally seemed to be deliberate. It's either, you know, kind of deliberate weighing costs against benefits, or it's seeking excitement. But I don't think they thought much about the victim, and I think that was a feature of the offenders. In a way, they lacked empathy. And I think actually one real thing I regret about this study is that we never had any proper measures of empathy. I mean, we found things like cruelty to animals predicted later delinquency, which suggests if you're cruel to animals, you sort of lack empathy. You don't appreciate what the animal's feeling, being anthropomorphic. But I think, really, if you measured empathy, you would find, certainly the literature would suggest that offenders are relatively low in empathy. And I think it's the low empathy which makes it easy for them to commit offences. They're not really, they put the victim to the back of their mind, basically. Or they have, as I say, techniques of neutralisation, which says, oh, no, it didn't affect them, you know, they're insured or whatever. They just, that's why I recommend, really, you know, cognitive interpersonal social skills training, because in social skills training, you're trying to get people to appreciate the views of other people. You're trying to get people to control their behaviour. You're trying to get them to appreciate what other people are thinking. And I think those kinds of techniques, which are used in institutions, you know, are very desirable and can be effective with people in getting them to think about other people's feelings, because most of the time the delinquents never think about other people's feelings, in our experience anyway.
I want to ask you about low intelligence, because I mean, even though we always find this correlation, there is a lot of discussion about what actually that means. And have you given that some thought as to what that means?
Yeah, I think obviously there are many possible hypotheses. I mean, some people would say it's all to do with school failure, you know, in the sense that intelligence tests are designed to predict school failure, and therefore, obviously, low intelligence is going to predict delinquency if there's some sort of causal link between school failure and delinquency, which actually many theories would suggest, like Al Cohen's theory or whatever. Many theories suggest a link between school failure and delinquency. I'm not sure that's true myself. I think my own pet theory is that it's to do with basically the ability to manipulate abstract concepts, because if you look at intelligence tests, what they're doing, they're testing your ability to manipulate abstract concepts. Usually they're doing that because they want to measure school success, and the key thing you need for school success is an ability to manipulate abstract concepts. But you see, if you can manipulate abstract concepts, then you can think about the future, because the future is an abstract concept. Then you can think about how the victim's feeling. That's an abstract concept. You're not feeling it. And then, then in a way you're less impulsive. So I think, to some extent, intelligence may be linked up to impulsiveness, and the whole ability to manipulate abstract concepts means you think more, you plan more. You think about the future. You think, if I do this, this may happen down the road, or this other person may be affected. I may not want to do this, that, and the other. And I think the low intelligence delinquency may not necessarily be school failure. It may be more to do with this poor ability to manipulate abstract concepts, which inevitably means poor planning ability. You work in the concrete rather than the abstract. You think of the here and now. You have immediate gratification rather than long-term deferral of gratification. That's my own pet theory, rather than school success. But it's, again, it's a very interesting question for research as to why you always find this link between low IQ and delinquency.